They say revolution doesn't come from noise. It comes from silence, from the quiet anger boiling in the hearts of those who can no longer endure suffering, from the hollow promises of leaders who wear suits and speak of peace while blood soaks the soil. And on one such day in West Africa, when hope seemed as dry as the harmattan wind, a man rose, not with a crown, not with a party, but with a purpose. His name was Ibrahim Traoré. He didn't appear in global headlines until the world had already labeled him a rebel. But those in Burkina Faso, they knew. They had seen him long before the camera scanned. A man shaped not by power, but by pressure. Born in 1988, raised in a humble home in Kubri, he wasn't the child of privilege or legacy. He was the product of a system that forced boys to become soldiers, and soldiers to become symbols. As a child, Ibrahim walked dusty roads to school, clutching notebooks that barely held together. At night, he listened to his father speak of the Sankar years, when Burkina Faso stood with its back straight and its head high. But even then, he understood something painful. Pride alone didn't fill empty stomachs. Dreams were not enough to stop bullets. He enrolled in the University of Ouagadougou, but it was the army that called louder. It offered structure, direction, and above all purpose. Traoré joined the military in his early 20s, excelling quickly. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but his commanders noted his discipline. He didn't speak unless he had something to say, and when he did, people listened. Years passed, the country burned. Jihadist insurgents swept across the Sahel like wildfire. Northern villages were reduced to rubble. People disappeared. Fear became a way of life. Governments changed, promises were made, but the terror never stopped. France sent troops, the UN sent advisors, but to many Burkina, all they brought was delay, more meetings, more missions, more mourning. Traoré was no general. He wasn't a politician. He was a captain, then a lieutenant, then a commander who didn't just give orders, he took risks. He rode with soldiers into hot zones. He walked among farmers in danger zones. He asked questions no one else dared. Why are our borders collapsing? Why are our youth dying in villages no one defends? Why do we fight for a flag when our leaders bow to foreign ones? And then came the final crack. By 2022, Paul-Henri Damiba's government, barely months old, was on the brink. Promises to end insecurity fell flat. Armed groups claimed more land. Civilians shouted for help. Soldiers whispered of betrayal. And in that silence, the name Traoré began to surface, not on television, but in the barracks, in the markets, in WhatsApp groups filled with worry. On September 30th, 2022, the silence shattered. Shots echoed through Ouagadougou. Soldiers seized state television. A new face emerged, not in a lavish press conference, but in a short, calm broadcast. A young man in uniform, red beret, stern face, steady voice. We are taking responsibility. We are not here for power. We are here because our people deserve security, and our nation deserves sovereignty. No chants, no victory parade, just a promise. But what the world missed in that moment was not the coup. It was the calm, the discipline, the terrifying clarity of a man who knew what he was stepping into. For coups are not games. They are oaths sealed by sacrifice. And Traoré, he didn't blink. From that moment on, Burkina Faso was no longer a forgotten land. It became a symbol of rebellion, of sovereignty, of defiance. Some hailed him as the African Siachi. Others branded him a military puppet, but none could ignore him. In the weeks that followed, foreign embassies grew nervous. France questioned the transition. The United Nations expressed concern. Western analysts speculated, is this another authoritarian rise? Another strongman narrative? But in Ouagadougou, the mood was different. People danced in the streets, painted murals of him. Young men began wearing red berets, not because they blindly followed him, but because, for the first time in years, they felt seen. But Traoré knew something the public didn't. Celebrations are easy. Governance is not. And what lay ahead was not applause, it was fire. His first act wasn't to sit in luxury. It was to clean house. Corrupt ministers, military officers aligned with foreign interests, those who had fed off instability for years gone. He reshuffled key positions, installed people who shared his vision, young, determined officers, loyal civilians, a cabinet that looked more like a mission squad than a government. He didn't hide behind curtains. He went to the north where most leaders feared to step. He met face to face with commanders, militia leaders, even frightened elders. His message was the same: we will not abandon you. But behind closed doors, there was chaos. International aid was being cut. Embassies began to downsize. France, feeling humiliated, started tightening diplomatic ropes. Rumors spread that an intervention might be considered. But Traoré, he didn't blink. Instead, he doubled down. He made the boldest move yet. He expelled French troops from Burkina Faso, the very force that had helped shape Sahel security policy for decades. Gone overnight, their bases dismantled, their flags lowered, their generals told to leave. And as French soldiers packed their trucks under the hot Sahel sun, Burkina civilians clapped, cheered, some even threw flowers. But underneath that pride, a new fear began to grow. Would jihadists now strike harder, seeing a weakened Burkina Faso? Would isolation cripple their economy? Was Traoré playing a dangerous game, or making the only move left? That question only deepened when unconfirmed reports began to circulate. Russian instructors, perhaps linked to the Wagner group, were arriving, military gear with Cyrillic markings, nighttime convoys, and suddenly, Burkina Faso was no longer just a country in transition. It became a pawn in a global game. Russia, France, the US all watching. But Traoré didn't flinch. In his public addresses, he never said Russia. He said sovereignty. He said, we will train our people to defend our soil, with whoever is willing to support us, without dictating terms. And in a televised speech that now echoes through Pan-African channels, he looked directly into the camera and said, Burkina Faso belongs to the people of Burkina Faso, not to those who offer us help with one hand and a leash with the other. It was a slap, a declaration, a spark. Soon after, Mali and Niger echoed similar sentiments. They too began cutting ties with France. They too began embracing a new direction. And suddenly, Traoré wasn't a lone rebel. He was the face of a movement. But movements need more than emotion. They need structure. They need results. So, he launched Operation Ceinture, a national mobilization. Civilians trained as local defense units. Tribal chiefs integrated into security councils. Young men and women offered stipends to guard their own lands. It was messy. It was ambitious. And it was the only thing standing between villages and armed insurgents. Meanwhile, in the shadows, threats grew. Leaked reports spoke of assassination plots, snipers, explosives, even attempts to sow division within his own army. But somehow, Traoré survived. He replaced guards, changed routes, went silent for weeks at a time, and then reappeared calm, unshaken. He knew the war wasn't just with jihadists. It was with every system, foreign and domestic, that profited from a weak Burkina Faso. So he fought it all. And the price? It began to show. The economy began to ache, with foreign funding drying up, and most international banks refusing to lend. The Burkina government had to make hard choices. Projects stalled, construction sites paused, importers faced delays. Inflation crept into markets. Bread and millet prices went up, and for the average family already on edge, it felt like the revolution was slipping into hunger. But Traoré didn't hide behind excuses. He addressed the nation in one of his late-night speeches. No teleprompter, no handlers, just him seated with dusty boots, eyes shadowed by fatigue. He said, we are suffering, but suffering is the road to dignity. We are bleeding, but bleeding is the price of standing up. And people listened, because even as their pockets emptied, they knew he was there, not in a foreign villa, not hiding behind armed convoys. He was touring barracks, sleeping in tents, walking the same unpaved roads. That's when his popularity exploded among the youth. In Burkina Faso and across Africa, Traoré became a symbol. His face appeared on t-shirts, murals, and phone wallpapers. Artists rapped about him. Students reenacted his speeches. For the first time, young men in internet cafes debated politics, comparing him to Sankara, Nkrumah, even Mandela. But elders warned, be careful of worshipping a man before he finish his journey, because even as people love him, whispers began. Stories of journalists arrested, radio stations shut down, online critics disappeared, yet citizens defended him. It's wartime, they said. This isn't normal democracy. We are at war. But human rights groups raised alarms. International media asked, is Traoré becoming authoritarian? In Brussels, Paris, and Washington, the question shifted from who is this man to how do we deal with him? Traoré responded with alliances, not traditional ones, but symbolic. He traveled to Mali, met with Colonel Assimi Goïta. Their handshake was brief, but powerful. West Africa will no longer dance to colonial drums. Then came Niger, then Guinea, and suddenly, it wasn't just about coups, it was about a shared belief. Sovereignty before diplomacy. They formed the Alliance of Sahel States, a pact to defend each other from foreign military pressure, a pact that challenged ECOWAS and the West. Tension followed. France reduced its operations. The EU warned of destabilization. The US cut ties. But Traoré, calm and firm, said, we are not isolating ourselves. We are reclaiming ourselves. Meanwhile, jihadists struck back. Attacks resumed. Villages fell. The price of sovereignty became human. Mass graves. Families displaced. Aid overwhelmed. Still, he pressed on. Operation Concord launched drones, border patrols, civilian involvement. But bullets couldn't feed the hungry. His fear was clear: win the war, lose the people. So, he turned inward, held town halls, sat with elders, walked into universities, not as a commander but as a listener. And something changed. Help us build, not just fight. He called on artisans to make uniforms, students to build surveillance tech, farmers to start grain banks. And slowly, a new message formed, not just of war, but of nationhood. Still, elections loomed. International pressure mounted. When would democracy return? Traoré didn't give dates. He gave conditions. Security first, infrastructure second, trust third. And some warned, that's the language of those who never leave. But others whispered, maybe that's the language of those who refuse to abandon a broken nation. Then came the incident that shook even his strongest supporters. A convoy of displaced villagers returning to their homes in the north was ambushed. Over 70 civilians, mostly women and children, were killed. The nation grieved. Opposition groups accused Traoré of failing to secure the roads he had promised were safe. Hashtags calling for accountability trended briefly, but he didn't vanish. He didn't send a press secretary. He went there, to the burnt wreckage, to the families who waited for bodies. And he apologized, not with excuses, not with political spin, but with silence, bowed head, and the words, I failed you, and I will do better. It wasn't enough, but it was human. And in a region where leaders rarely take blame, it struck a chord. Meanwhile, intelligence leaked. A regional bloc was considering military action to restore democracy. ECOWAS meetings turned tense. Rumors of sanctions turned into announcements. Borders were shut. Banks froze transfers. Traoré called it economic warfare. And yet, he didn't retaliate. Instead, he gathered his counterparts, Mali, Niger, Guinea. They issued a joint declaration. If one of us is touched, all of us respond. That was the moment everything shifted. What began as isolated military takeovers had now become a united regional bloc with military, political, and ideological alignment. They called themselves the New Sahel Alliance, but some observers had a darker name for it: the Rebellion Belt. Western diplomats panicked. French think tanks warned of a collapse of influence. The US labeled it a potential flashpoint for Russian expansion. Russia, on the other hand, praised African sovereignty. And so Traoré's world shrank and grew at the same time. Fewer trade deals, but more unity. Less foreign praise, but more local pride. He visited a school in Bobo-Dioulasso, where children painted his face alongside Sankara. They called him the Red Beret of Redemption. But behind the admiration was exhaustion. The war against terrorism was not over. The roads were still unsafe. Refugee camps were overcrowded. Drones buzzed above villages. And the elite in Ouagadougou, once quiet, began to murmur, "We need our lives back." Yet, still, the youth stood firm. Because for all the pain, they saw something their parents never did. A leader who looked them in the eye. Who stayed. Who bled with them. And then came whispers of elections. International observers demanded timelines. Traoré gave no dates. He only said, "Elections are not a finish line. They are a milestone. First, we must walk together." And that line, so simple, yet so loaded, split the nation again. Some said he was becoming a dictator in uniform. Others said he was the only honest leader they'd ever seen. So, what is he? A revolutionary? A military opportunist? A transitional hero? A future strongman? Or something new? Even today, no one knows for sure. And maybe that's the point. Because Ibrahim Traoré is not a finished chapter. He is a live page, still being written in dust and sweat and sacrifice. His legacy will not be defined by corps command, but by how his people remember him when the uniforms are gone and the gunfire fades. As the sun sets over Ouagadougou, the red berets are still worn. The murals still glow under streetlights. But the real measure of this story is not in what the world thinks. It's in what Burkina Faso becomes, a country haunted by its past, or one finally walking toward its own future, even if barefoot. And if Traoré is the one leading that walk, then history is watching closely.